Please welcome the panel on The New Climate Reality, Financing for Adaptation, Resilience, and Recovery, moderated by CEO of Christensen Global, Amy Christensen.
Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to be here and have a fantastic panel for a pretty critical conversation today. As you all may have been hearing over the last few days, we have a huge climate crisis on our hands, but we also have an opportunity. And as we're seeing momentum in the climate solution space with capital flowing to climate mitigation, as of this time, it's approximated that only 19% of climate financial flows have any focus on resilience, adaptation, and recovery. And the vast majority is covered by international public financial institutions. So we're still underfinancing climate mitigation, and we're dramatically underfinancing climate adaptation, resilience, and recovery. And today, we have a fantastic panel to talk about what is finance for adaptation, resilience, and recovery, and what is the role of the private sector, and also how can philanthropic and public capital help get that private capital off of the sidelines by de-risking it and otherwise helping to attract that capital into this marketplace. We're also going to have a significant focus on the most vulnerable, given, of course, there's the massive injustice that happens with climate change, where those who have contributed the least to climate impacts and the climate disaster we're facing are being hit the worst and first by the climate impacts and have the fewest resources to deal with it. So we're going to be talking about the most vulnerable and the type of capital needed to help to support them in dealing with the impacts of climate change. But there's some good news. Recently, the philanthropic community at COP28 announced 21 different foundations came together, as you may have heard at a previous discussion. They came together to announce a commitment to adaptation and resilience financing. But again, that's the philanthropic community. But we're fortunate they're stepping forward. Again, how can we leverage their flexible grant and other very flexible risk-tolerant capital to help to mobilize private investment? So I have a fantastic panel, as I said, with us today, people who are actually not only experts, but deploying capital, shaping capital structures to address this issue. Immediately to my left is Gillian Caldwell, who is the Chief Climate Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, a longtime climate advocate, thinker, doer, leader, and we're really grateful to have you in the administration working to realign those public development funds for climate mitigation and adaptation. And we have Jeff Goodell, contributing writer at Rolling Stone magazine, long time with Rolling Stone, but also author, award-winning author of multiple books across climate, everything from Big Coal to How to Cool the Planet to most recently, The Water Will Come and the Heat Will Kill You First. He's always the guy I set up to really bring us down. Let's have a reality check about where we are. And then to his left is Ekoswahi Iuse. Sorry, Ekoswahi Iuse, I apologize. She is the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum, which is a critical institution to help to fill the gaps where insurance has yet to be focused enough. And so I'm excited to hear from Ekoswahi and where we need to be mobilizing more capital, especially for the most vulnerable. And then Stacy Swan, who's the founder of Resilient Earth Capital and a longtime leader in blended capital strategies for climate, including 10 years at the International Financial Corporation, which of course the entire job is figuring out how public resources can attract private capital into development. So with that, Jeff, I wanted to start with you, as always, set us up with a reality check. But I think one of our goals here is to really understand where are we with climate impacts, and therefore what is adaptation, resilience, and recovery? What does that need to look like? So you've been such an insightful observer. It would just be helpful to hear your thoughts about what you're seeing as far as those accelerating impacts on climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Amy and I have done lots of panels together, and she likes to start with me because, as she joked last night, it's always up after my conversation. So I'm going to reverse that, though. I'm actually, it's inevitable in a conversation like this that people will ask about hope and things, and I want to start with a kind of a vision of hope that I have right now, which is that I think that we are at a kind of tipping point of understanding risks and opportunity with climate change low after all these 30 or 40 years. I think the dynamic is changing in real time right now. And that presents a whole new kind of suite of risks and opportunities. And let me just talk briefly about what's happening on our planet right now. As most of you probably know, 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded in human history. The last 10 years have been the hottest 10 years recorded. If you want to get into a fight with a climate scientist, ask him or her about whether or not this means climate impacts are accelerating or not. There's a lot of debate going on about that right now, but it's very clear that we are getting deeper and deeper into trouble. In my book about heat, I talk about heat as the engine of planetary chaos. And that's certainly what we're seeing right now. Seeing it in the floods in Brazil, we're seeing it in the heat waves in Southeast Asia right now. But we're also seeing it in the some of the larger ecosystem changes on our planet, like, for example, the West Antarctic ice sheet, which has long been a subject of discussion among scientists about how stable it is. The West Antarctic ice sheet is like the cork in the wine bottle for the whole west side of Antarctica, and were it to go away, it would be about 10 feet of sea level rise. And the question is how stable that is and how fast that could happen. Implications, of course, for virtually every coastal city in the world is enormous. And I've been to Antarctica. I wrote about it in my book. I went to the West Antarctic ice sheet. And one of the things that happened in recent months is that a very significant study by basically the best ice scientists in the world have said that this disintegration of this ice sheet is underway. And it is happening. And the question is not reversible in any kind of real time. So the question is how fast that will happen, what the implications of that will be. So we're seeing things like that. We're seeing further and further evidence of the changes in the ocean. The ocean is hotter than it's ever been. Seeing rising surface temperatures. We're seeing right now coral bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef and other places, very significant bleaching events with lasting damages to coral reefs. And we're also seeing the famous Day After Tomorrow scenario that maybe some of you have seen this movie Day After Tomorrow, where the overturning circulation in the Atlantic stops or slows down significantly and causes tremendous changes in our planet. That has long been, in fact, when I first started writing about climate change 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that was the first thing that people were thinking about and debating about. And we have evidence this year now that it actually is slowing, and it's slowing faster than we think. So the point of all this is that with this acceleration of warming, we are seeing bigger and bigger impacts, right? And those impacts are going to continue as long as we continue burning fossil fuels and heating up the planet. Now, the opportunity here is that we have not really begun to register this. One of my goals is to talk about the scope and scale of these changes that are coming, so that I think we can't really talk about the finance opportunities and what we need to do about this until we realize the sort of magnitude of the changes. There was a story in the Financial Times yesterday about the requirement of climate finance. We're at about 1.2 billion now, and we need to get to 9 billion by 2030 to hit the Paris goals. So there's this tremendous opportunity that is going to happen here. And the question is, how do we shift these great flows of money, not just to mitigation, but more powerfully and more importantly and in a more complex way to adaptation? And that's what we will talk about today.
Thank you. So I think that was a useful reality check for all of us. As always, thank you. But really, it is a call to urgent action. And so, Stacey, I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about what does that investment opportunity look like?
Yeah, and so thank you for moderating us, Amy, and I'm happy to be here. And Jeff, I'm really glad you started with the vision of hope, even though you've level set us on kind of the reality of the accelerating impacts, physical impacts of climate change that are happening. But I'll pick up on the hope part, because I do think we are at the cusp of almost a watershed moment, no pun intended, in how we invest around climate change. And part of this is because the physical impacts from the warming planet are obvious, and investors are starting to wake up around this. So the probabilities are changing. Jeff, you mentioned the Antarctic ice sheet. I think last year it was, its melting was so low that on the probability distribution, it was called a 6 sigma event, which is something like a 1 in 2 billion chance of happening, right? So this is happening in kind of extreme rainfall. It's happening in extreme heat around the world. It's happening in flooding, in extreme storms and things like that. And that's having an effect on how we think about the risks to assets and the risks to investments, and also the tools that investors used up until now to address those risks. And we'll talk about insurance as we go along here. But one of the tools that most people historically have been using is insurance. Insurance is not a risk reduction tool, it's a risk transfer mechanism. And to the extent that that's true, I think investors are starting to understand that you can't actually transfer away this risk. You actually need to also reduce it, because if you do not, this impacts your revenues, it impacts your cost basis, it impacts your asset values, and that's true in the global north and in the global south. This is something that is kind of equally affecting investment around the world in terms of where some of the financial risks are coming from climate change. But how does that lead to a vision of hope, right? I actually think investors, when they start to wake up to these ideas of risk, will start to integrate into how they make their investment analysis, how they identify, assess, quantify climate-related financial risk, and it could produce different types of investment outcomes, right? Investors, for example, looking to invest in real estate in the west coast of Florida, where there is no insurance for some assets, are going to think twice about investing in those assets. Now, then we have a different problem to solve, which we can talk about when we talk about the public-private, using the public balance sheet and things like that. But I do think this awakening of investors around the financial risk from climate change will start to produce greater action around investing in the right things, and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, I'd love to get into some more specifics of what that looks like. But first, I wanted to go to Gillian Caldwell. Gillian, you're working within a development institution. Your primary priority is development. How are you integrating climate impacts and resilience and adaptation into your deployment of resources and your priorities at USAID?
Sure. Well, first, for people who may be unfamiliar with USAID, we are a branch of the federal government. We're the largest aid agency in the world. Our budget varies between about $30 to $50 billion a year, and we have a presence in 100 countries worldwide, the low and middle income countries. We do no work in the United States. Our focus is on the countries getting hit first and worst by the impacts of the climate crisis. And one of the first things that we did after I started as a Biden appointee in 21 was finalize a climate strategy that takes us through 2030. And there are a range of high-level objectives for achievement by 2030, but one is to catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance to advance specific goals around reducing carbon emissions and increasing the resilience of these communities to climate impacts. And that's so important. I think you cited a 9 billion figure, but you might have meant to say 9 trillion. Figures are all over the place.
Thank you. I was going to correct that.
So I typically cite the 3 to 5 trillion, but maybe the price tag's gone up by 2030. Who knows? Basically, we're at least a 600% increase from where we are now in terms of the gap in climate finance to address the consequences and try to reduce the rising temperatures, which will only make the situation worse than it already is. And you mentioned the paltry funds for adaptation. You mentioned something along the lines of 20% globally, but only 2% of the private capital going to address the crisis is going to adaptation. The vast majority of that is going to the renewable energy transition and so-called mitigation. So USAID has really made it a priority through President Biden's PREPARE initiative, which is the emergency initiative on adaptation and resilience, to try to catalyze more private sector investment. And this is something I think aid agencies, donor agencies around the world within governments really need to start thinking about and are thinking about. How can we use our capital in more creative ways? Because if you're following the UNFCCC and the climate negotiations, you'll know that only in 22 was the first time we were projected to have reached the $100 billion commitment made under the Paris Agreement. And again, we're talking 3 to 5 trillion, and the public agencies can't even get to 100 billion. You know we've got to start to use our capital in more creative ways. So that's concessional finance, those are loan guarantees, and the technical assistance necessary to establish deal flow that's actually investable. The other thing we did, which my colleague Lindsay Doyle, who's here in the audience, has been leading, is call to action to the private sector. So at the last COP climate negotiations this year, we announced that we've recruited over 25 companies that have committed a combined $3 billion in both cash and in-kind resources to advance adaptation and resilience. So that might involve strengthening their own supply chains or the preparedness of their workforce. But even more importantly, it could also involve changes to the products and services that they're offering. One big field of activity right now we've already talked about, and Ekoshui is going to refer to more, is insurance, something called parametric insurance, right? How do you ensure that smallholder farmers who are being hit by drought or floods get automated payouts algorithmically based on predictable weather events that would reduce the cost of purchasing that insurance and increase their ability to sustain their families through the kinds of climate impacts we're looking at. We've got another partner called Jupiter, really amazingly actually, can take a specific location and predict by 2100 the costs associated across 8 core risk factors, whether it's heat, drought, floods, or 5 other related risks. What are the costs that are going to be incurred in each of those risk categories at that point on the map? Which of course is incredibly relevant, not just to businesses, but also to the local communities, so they can think about how they can try to mitigate those risks. So I'll leave it there for now, because I know we've got more to say.
We do, and we'll dive into it for sure, but it's a perfect time to bring in Ekoshui to the conversation and the role of insurance. And how is the insurance industry reacting? We've seen them pull out of places like California and Western Florida, places that are facing the greatest risk and the dire consequences of that, especially to vulnerable communities. But globally, where do you see the insurance industry playing in this? What's their role? And where does the Insurance Development Forum, where are you all stepping in as well?
Okay, thank you, Amy, for that. It's great to be on the panel and to see so much reference to insurance. I'm not sure if that's the norm, so really, really positive. So maybe I'll add a little bit of context and maybe offer a few facts that people don't often think about in terms of insurance and the role of insurance, and also the incentive when we think about climate change, resilience, and adaptation. So globally, insurers collect a premium volume of about US $7 trillion on an annual basis, and of that, pay through claims benefits 5 to 5.5 trillion per annum to global financial resilience in the form of insurance claims and benefits payouts. So that's quite significant. And oftentimes we don't think about this contribution that insurance makes in terms of supporting resilience, the ability of people to respond to shocks, etc. And this is the largest contribution when you think about to society in terms of resilience, financial protection outside of governments directly. And this is also not considering that apart from their underwriting capabilities, insurers are also institutional investors, right? 40 trillion of assets that they under management with, for the insurance industry. So to your question, I think it is inherently within the interest of the insurance industry to take climate risk and resilience and adaptation seriously. seriously. And to the point that you made, Stacia, we are seeing issues where if we are not investing adequately in resilience, risk reduction, access to insurance becomes an issue. And there are cascading impacts which can be quite profound. So when we think about where we see value within this context, I will focus on three areas in particular. The first is around risk expertise and risk analytics. And again, what underpins the ability of the industry to underwrite these risks is actually the technical capability to understand what does that risk actually look like, how is it changing, how is it evolving across the world. Shock might happen in Thailand, but it has impact in the United States. How do we manage that at a sovereign level? How do you manage that at a corporate level? So there's a lot of work that we are investing as the insurance industry, but also within the Insurance Development Forum, to look at how we bring those capabilities to bear in terms of how communities and governments are understanding these risks, right? Yeah. And are using that information to make difficult choices, because we are also in an environment where there is a challenge in terms of the availability of resources. So I think that is a basic contribution, an area where as an industry we are really trying to tackle this issue. There are limits, we recognize them to some of the tools that we have. It also means an evolution of those tools to meet the challenge, but it's something that's firmly on our radar. The second area where I think we see tremendous opportunity is obviously around underwriting. And despite the big figures that I referenced, those payouts and those benefits are primarily concentrated in developed economies. As the Insurance Development Forum, our efforts are really focused on how do we expand insurance and risk capabilities in emerging developing markets. And the reason that is relevant is because in these markets, we are talking about 2 to 3% insurance penetration rates. So when you have an event occurring in Burkina Faso, it is very different from when an event occurs in Germany, right? Mm-hmm. You have a flood event. It's not only the government that has to divert resources from education, critical infrastructure. It means that families ultimately pay the price, right? And they pay the price through reducing food intake. They pay the price through pulling children out of school. And that impact is not short-term, it's also generational in some instances. And so for us, there's a lot of work that we need to do in terms of how do we build those markets and that shock absorption capacity within emerging developing countries to actually deal with what we are seeing coming at us with climate change. And there's a little bit of irony, if I can say, because we are now seeing what's happening in the United States, more developed markets, and the sudden uproar around affordability, access of insurance. But this has been an issue in emerging markets for a very long time when we look at issues around the protection gap. The third area where I think there's a lot of opportunity that we see and a role that we see that the insurance industry can also play is back to my earlier point around institutional investors. How do we drive some of that investment into infrastructure in developing emerging markets? And how do we ensure that those investments are actually resilient, that they're actually able to deal with the kinds of realities that we are seeing into the future? And I can expand a little bit on that, but across the board, I think what is clear from our side, when we work in terms of the insurance industry, is there are capabilities, there are tools, there are opportunities, but it's also going to require partnership with the public sector. And as we know, when we talk about PPPs, it's very easy to talk about it, to translate it into action is a completely different ballgame. So those are my immediate reflections.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd like to dig into a little bit more around what does investing in resilience, adaptation, recovery look like? You gave some examples of some of your partnerships. Also, Ekoswehi, I know that you all are working to encourage the insurance industry more specifically to finance resilient infrastructure. So could you speak a little bit to that? And then, Jeff, I'd like to come to you and give us some broader context for this operating environment that we're in right now. So Ekoswehi, a little bit more on that work. Thank you.
Yeah, I can share a bit on that. As I said, as an institution, it's quite interesting when you go and engage with the government in a developing country and you talk about insurance. But if you don't have schools and roads, right? What is this? So for as the IDF, we've been really trying to think where can we add value to this conversation that we are having with many of the governments that we engage around this issue. And so we started, and we've been looking at this issue for some time, but over the past year, we set ourselves the challenge of pulling together CIOs from a variety of insurance companies around the IDF table to say, what would it take for you to invest in these markets? What are the core requirements that you need to see satisfied in order for this to happen? And it was a difficult task, as you can imagine, pulling huge corporations to sit around the table, CIOs, negotiating what are their red lines, what is acceptable. You know, there are private companies, there's a certain expectation in terms of return. And we landed on a term sheet or a blueprint, that's what we're calling it, where I think there was consensus across the membership that these are certain requirements, if met, would allow us to invest in these markets. And as part of that, we also went through a process of trying to, an RFP to get a general partner on board. And so we're working closely with BlackRock to operationalize that. And again, in keeping with the IDF's mission, we wanted to create a fund that would add value. So it's focused on financing small to medium-sized infrastructure, a keen focus on what does resilience look like in terms of the kinds of things that we're investing in, and small to medium-sized infrastructure because we want to be able to see impact, right, by a certain time frame. We also want to use that as a vehicle where industry members can learn about these markets, learn about, you know, their processes, and also use that to inform their mainstream activities. So for us, it's also about using the opportunity to catalyze even greater action. And I think that those are the kinds of models that give me hope, to the point earlier, in terms of the transformation that we are seeing.
Yeah, thank you. It's helpful. So, Jeff, just not to take us away from hope, but let's lean into
You can
hope.
always count on me for
Let's
that.
lean into hope. But we also have a reality that somewhere around $5 to $7 trillion a year are going still towards the things we don't want to be financing anymore through subsidies. So I was just going to ask you about, you know, having written King Coal, studied the fossil fuel industry for a long time. Just a little bit of a picture around where things stand with the fossil fuel industry and their role in this. If EcoSway is bringing the insurance industry to the table, you know, certainly the fossil fuel industry not only has a lot of public capital coming its way, also has a lot of capital and infrastructure here. So I was just curious about your sense of the role of the fossil fuel industry as we work to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most complicated, politically complex, politically volatile parts of this whole conversation, right? I mean, let's be very clear, you know, burning fossil fuels is responsible for about 80% of the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere, which is what is heating up our planet, which is causing all of these impacts that we're talking about, this adaptation that we're trying to finance. All of this stuff is being driven by burning fossil fuels. There's obviously other things involved, but that is the key engine of what we're talking about. And so the question becomes, what is the responsibility of that industry, right? And what is the sort of economic fairness of, you know, I'm a little jet lagged right now because I was just in Tbilisi, Georgia, for a meeting with the Asian Development Bank, and I met with the finance minister of Bhutan, who made the point very clearly to me, saying, we put 0 carbon into the atmosphere for all intents and purposes, nothing. And we are suffering many, many consequences of climate change, from glacial lake outbursts to changing disease pattern vectors, dengue and Zika, things like that, an exodus of people because of these kinds of risks, crop failures, all kinds of things. And, you know, her question is, what is the responsibility of the sort of rich global north to the people who caused this problem to help us in adaptation? And that's, of course, at the center of the work you do with the Green Climate Fund. But I think that, you know, it's becoming, the politics are shifting on this. And, you know, it's not by accident that there are now, I think the correct number I checked this morning, 2,180 lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry now. Hugely accelerated from the last few years. People are beginning to think about what happened to this question of the polluter pays principle. An industry that had, $4 trillion in profits last year? Do they have any obligation to help in this river of cash that we need? Those are complicated questions. There's a lot of back and forth about that, but I can tell you as someone who's reporting on the front lines of this kind of stuff, these questions are becoming more and more central and more a part of this conversation about these rivers of cash that would need to get shifted. Well, there is a very big river of cash with the fossil fuel industry, and what role do they play in helping us to adapt to this hotter, more chaotic world that they've helped create?
Yeah, certainly the defense industry has traditionally had offset requirements when they have opportunities to sell weapons into countries. So what are those requirements? What are those new mechanisms, new tools we need to be thinking about to getting more capital, more resources into adaptation quickly? So, yeah.
Well, can I just comment on that? I mean, I think beyond the question you raised regarding legal or financial responsibility, there's a question of governments and the responsibility they have to fulfill the commitments they've made, right? All the G7 countries have committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, and that's not what's happening. We're here in the United States, rife with production and consumption subsidies. And 2022, which is the last year we really have the data for, in the wake of the war in Ukraine, was some of the highest subsidy investments ever, trillions of dollars, direct, maybe an estimated 1.2 trillion. If you combine that with indirect, we're looking at 7 trillion. So we go back to the numbers we described in the 3 to 5 trillion. It's bizarre because we're investing at direct cross purposes with where we need to head in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And the big success story is that renewable energy is still cheaper in the countries where we're working. I mean, the prices have decreased so dramatically that it's the energy of choice for our partner countries, and they make their own determinations about where they want to head with their energy future. So anyway, I mean, I think we need to make really thoughtful decisions and not think in short-term ways about our political futures. That's part of the problem we have, is that the political cycles are such that and companies have a great enough hold on politics that we don't see decisions made in the public interest. We see them more frequently made in private interests.
Yeah, it's just a misdirected incentives for our policymakers right now. So in spite of that, so I think it's important to underline that that's the operating environment we're in right now. Let's work on a longer term shift of that capital to provide a more level playing field and to move in the short term more resources into resilience. But also, given where we are right now, what are you all seeing in investing in resilience and adaptation from the private sector? And what's the role that you've seen from philanthropy or other concessional sources of capital from the public sector, the multilateral development banks? Stacey, I thought I would turn to you and just ask for some examples of what does this look like? We know there are resilience investment funds out there that are attracting capital and deploying it. So could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, sure. And I will pick up on something Gillian just said, because the public balance sheet is an investor too, right? And the public balance sheet in many countries is bearing the cost of the damages of the warming planet that we are living in. So it's actually, you could kind of take this and turn this a little bit into kind of, it's an efficient, more effective use of public balance sheets to catalyze the investment in resilience. Now, we all know that the trillions of dollars we need for climate change, whether it's 9 or higher than that, is not going to be done off the back of a public dollar alone. It has to be leveraged with private capital. But it absolutely is the most efficient use of that public capital to do it in a way that orients it towards adaptation, resilience, and mitigation, right? So when you think of the climate debates, there's very few debate around investing in resilience or investing in things that address physical impacts. The energy transition and the mitigation side of the climate debate is a little bit more complicated by politics. But actually, if you think about the cost to the public balance sheet as the planet is warming, it makes total sense. And it's far more efficient to think about using that public dollars and those public balance sheets to direct in the right ways towards investing in resilience and adaptation. And one of the things that's a bright spot in the United States is the Inflation Reduction Act and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a basket of incentives that's going to promote it's going to promote a lot of energy transition, but it's actually going to raise awareness around the climate issue at the front lines of many communities. And I think you're going to see off of that, I hope, a reduction in the politicking around this. So I have a lot of, I think that the people who have been working in concessional finance and in leveraging public balance sheets have been pretty tactical and strategic around how they're doing that in the last couple of years. What does it look like? Actually, it looks like a lot of infrastructure. So what you were talking about, it looks like how do you build in resilience to certain types of climate-related physical hazards in infrastructure? That's very locational. But it also looks like data and analytics, and it also looks like water. A lot of water investments are important from a resilience perspective. It looks like agriculture. I mean, the food systems are going to be impacted tremendously by a warming planet. This is not just a specific, unique, bespoke asset class. This is every sector and every industry. And then thinking about how to take the spectrum of capital and apply it in the most effective and efficient ways is going to be, I think, a lot of the opportunity set that investors are looking for. I will also say I was in a room yesterday where one very large asset manager said it was a $200 trillion investment opportunity. Now, this person meant mitigation and adaptation, but that was the largest number I'd heard. 9 trillion was the last number that I'd been hearing, but a $200 trillion investment opportunity for climate change, much of which is adaptation and resilience, is kind of amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Can I also go on?
Okay.
Okay, well, just on that, because I see someone from BCG in the audience, there was a report they did as part of our Prepare Call to Action, which is focused on the business case for adaptation, because nobody wants to hear an aid agency tell them how to do business, right? We need actually hard data to understand what's happening with those capital flows and what yield companies are getting from the investments they're making. And what this study showed is that many more companies than we realized are actually making investments in the resilience of their supply chain and their workforces and in adapting their products and services, and that the median yield for those investments is $9 for every one, which is a lot higher, frankly, than I anticipated it would be, because we know that in general, adaptation-related investments are not as profitable as mitigation. You're going to go ahead.
Well, I think that myth is being broken,
Yeah.
actually. I think the kind of myth of 10 years ago that adaptation was more expensive, actually today, as you integrate into the full cost-benefit analysis, or you integrate the accelerating costs of certain things that you would have otherwise used to mitigate the climate-related financial risks, because that, like insurance, because those things are also changing in dynamic, I actually think that investing in resilience and adaptation is actually going to prove to be more financially sustainable and also a higher return.
Yeah.
We might be coming into that.
We know for the aid dollars,
now.
every $1 we spend on adaptation and resilience yields an estimated 4 to 10 in cost savings down the line. And we're the world's largest humanitarian responder, when an earthquake hits or when war breaks out. So we have some data to draw from on that point. But I interrupted you previously.
No. I just want to react on the $200 trillion comment, which I think is probably an understatement. I think one of the things that gets lost in talking about all of this is the scale of the opportunity. And one of the things that I think even people who understand climate change and what's happening don't really understand, there's this notion that we're going to get our act together and we're going to reduce emissions and we're going to kind of go back to the way things were. I think a really fundamental point in thinking about this future from an investment point of view, from every point of view, is that we are not going back. Because of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, because of the fact that it's more or less permanent, we have created a new climate. And it's very different than the climate that all of us in this room grew up in. And that means that everything is going to change. It means where we get our food is going to change. How we build our buildings is going to change. Our politics is going to change. Immigration is going to change. It is a different world that we have created for ourselves. We are not going back. And so if you get smart about that, and you understand that, and you think, well, okay, if we're going to change everything, then what are my opportunities? There's a lot of opportunities. And so my sense is that this scale is underestimated.
Yep.
The hard thing for me in thinking about this is it's one thing to think about infrastructure investment and things like that. The harder thing is to think about human lives. Extreme heat I just wrote a book about it. We don't have any good numbers on how many people are dying from extreme heat, but Lancet, one of the top sort of medical publications, estimates that around 400,000 people a year. It's going to get more and more as it gets hotter and hotter. How does that get valued in this conversation? How does I call heat in my book a predatory force, and how do we put that calculation into these kinds of investment changes that we are talking about?
Akosua, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, just building on the point that Jeff made, and I think that that's a really important part of the resilience adaptation conversation, right? Which is really the opportunity to focus on people, right? On lives and livelihoods. Yeah. And I get the sense that, historically when we've talked about climate and the mitigation space, it's at such a high level that it's almost disenfranchised, if I can use that word,
exactly.
or made it inaccessible, right? Yeah. This conversation around climate to people and their lives and their livelihoods. So from my perspective, a lot of the work that we do, even around the risk analytics, is trying to unwrap what does that look like. So when we work, the increasing interest that we are seeing from the humanitarian community that tell us that when there is a flood in Mozambique, it is not just the loss of infrastructure and schools and everything that happens there, but 6 months down the line, they're facing cholera outbreaks. What does that look like from a risk modeling perspective, from a risk financing perspective? And so for us, that's extremely challenging in terms of how we understand these risks. But again, to your point, it's an opportunity to engage communities around what impact means, but importantly, what does it mean to change finance? Again, and I'll make a final point. Some of these changes that we need to make are not so out extreme, right? Again, to the point of humanitarian financing, last year it was $64 billion, right? Half of that driven by climate, earthquakes, etc. Only 1.2% is prearranged. So that's extreme levels of inefficiency. So if we are talking about, climate transition, justice, etc., there is a conversation around the use of this financing in an efficient way to meet the needs of people and communities. And for me, that's why the resilience adaptation conversation is incredible, right, at this point.
Absolutely. I wanted to make a note that we are taking questions. And so if we could have the QR code up for folks to submit questions there. There are also folks watching live online. They will magically pop up here on the iPad. And I'd love to take some questions from you all in the audience and from folks online. In advance of that, I wanted to ask, I recall at the Paris Climate Talks 2015, I can't believe it's been 9 years, a number of institutional folks were in the room talking about this and how a 4-degree world is absolutely unhedgeable, too much chaos. And so, Jeff, to your point, changing everything. This is a new world. And yet, I'm wondering to what extent we're seeing that institutional capital get into resilience and adaptation. I'm curious, Akosua, you mentioned BlackRock working with you on this new fund around small to medium-sized resilient infrastructure. Are you all seeing some of the larger institutional players who are here at Milken? Are you seeing them getting into this space? What are they looking at? We talk about investing in resilience, adaptation, and recovery, and there's also mitigating the risk of the existing portfolios you're invested in. But setting that aside, which they absolutely must be doing urgently given the scale of the risk to existing portfolios, how do you see them engaging and proactively investing in resilience, recovery, and adaptation? Go ahead.
I would say one thing that is really important to set the stage, going back to my earlier remarks about trying to reduce some of the risk, is new financial instruments and infrastructure. So in January, USAID helped launch something called the Green Guarantee Company, which is the first privately held guarantee company underwritten by USAID, the UK government, the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Authority, the Green Climate Fund, initially capitalized with $100 million, projected to catalyze $1 billion, a 10x return, specifically focused on bringing new investments, ensuring investments, providing that first loss guarantee capability and other concessional finance in the least developed countries, in the higher risk rating markets, where it's difficult to get the foreign direct investment involved. The other thing we're doing is actually working with financial institutions, banks inside countries like Rwanda and Colombia, to help them understand how to green their own portfolios. Because if you look at GFANS, the Global Alliance for Net Zero, the banking institutions heavily dominated by the global north and the west, and that's because of the capability required to really understand the carbon footprint and to track a trajectory to get there. But if we don't have these institutions in the global south making these investments, we're surely not going to be able to expect those from the global north, which have more capital on their hands, to be following suit. So I think there's a question of, to your point, no, we're not seeing a lot of this investment on the adaptation side of the balance sheet, more on mitigation, but the lines are not so hard and fast between those two terrains. And in a lot of cases, investments you're making in reducing emissions are likewise investments in increasing adaptation. In agriculture, for example, to move to shade-grown coffee, that's a resilience play as well as a mitigation play.
Absolutely. I'm glad you raised that. I'd love to talk about that as well. Stacey.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was brought up in a panel earlier today was the pipeline problem. And I think for infrastructure, the fact is that big infrastructure projects take a long time to move through an investment process. So the pipeline of projects that are coming through is slower. So a project that's being financially closed today was probably on the drawing board 5 or 7 years ago. And the question is, were the developers who were putting that project together or the investors around the table that helped to finance it asking the right questions about the climate-related physical risks and or the resilience of that asset over its lifetime? And the likelihood is they weren't yet. I think that's changing. We were working with a couple of Canadian pension funds 3-4 years ago on this issue, and they were asking us to help them figure out how their investment diligence process would need to change in order to be able to capture some of the resilient infrastructure and climate-related mitigation projects that they wanted to fund and invest in their portfolio, in part because they wanted to do more climate investment. And the real kind of thing that we were doing was helping them with diligence questions and helping them figure out how to diligence a project around climate, which I think is starting to change faster than I expected, but still there's a lot of work to do. And then there's not enough pipeline in queue at the big scale. Now, we're seeing a lot of investment and a lot of entrepreneurs, so small companies, SMEs, people in the frontline communities coming up with solutions to certain types of hazards that they're seeing, whether it's water, heat. But those projects are small. No pension fund is going to invest in them. No big asset manager is going to invest in them. Anything less than $5 million is not on the radar of a lot of the investors in those discussions. So there's got to be a lot of ecosystem build out in the financial sector around this. But we really do have to kind of figure out how to increase the pipeline of these types of investments.
So given the scarcity of resources and given the focus has been on mitigation, where are you seeing some of those win-win uses of capital where the same dollar that's going to mitigation is also delivering on adaptation and resilience? Some of the obvious areas are in agriculture, but other examples that you all are seeing?
Yeah, I will throw one out there. I sit on the board of a green bank here in the United States, and our green bank is hyper local, as many green banks are. And we were originally established for clean energy as our mandate. 2 years ago, the legislators of kind of that control our green bank included adaptation and resilience. So a lot of our portfolio at the green bank is buildings and building efficiency. And now we're doing a lot of investment in multifamily buildings that also includes resilience. So we're looking at the kind of physical impacts of climate change in the place where our green bank operates and doing things around floods, flood mitigation, flood management, also emergency services type resilience. So resilience centers in, bigger, complexes and things like that. So coupling both the energy efficiency, the solar, the electrification of buildings with resilience measures is happening kind of on both sides, which is quite interesting.
I think another example is coastal ecosystems. Yeah. So the so-called blue economy, mangroves and seagrasses are carbon-dense terrain. Actually, in seagrasses, even more carbon-dense than some of the thickest forest canopy. That has, if you're really investing in that kind of green infrastructure rather than the gray infrastructure, you're protecting coastal communities against erosion and, sort of the incursion of water and sea level rise, even as you're helping reduce carbon in the atmosphere. And that's where the carbon markets become interesting, as complicated as they are. And we have to ensure we have, the integrity of those credits and the transparency of those transactions and the equity that communities deserve where they're creating the value. It's some of the only way to capitalize these kinds of interventions in biodiversity and in restoring natural landscapes is through the sale of carbon credits.
Yep. Go ahead, John.
Well, I just wanted to make one point that we were talking a lot about adaptation here, and that's really important. Obviously not anywhere near enough money is flowing in that direction. But there tends to be this sort of binary conversation in climate about mitigation and adaptation, and they're talked about as if they're separate things sometimes. And it's really, I think, important to underscore that they're not separate things, that the best way to adapt, the best adaptation practice we could take is to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, because that is what's driving all of these kinds of changes, right? So mitigation is the most powerful form of adaptation. And to make that point, I live in Texas, which is like the belly of the beast, fossil fuel-wise, right? And both from the climate impacts point of view and from the fossil fuel industry, the oil industry that is there. I checked the grid 2 weeks before I left. I've been traveling. 70% of the power on our grid was coming from renewables, right? And that is not happening because Texas is full of tree huggers who, that is not what's the engine there is economics, right? And permitting. And John Podesta was very articulate about this yesterday in his discussion about the importance of speed, right? That when we think about adaptation and mitigation, speed is what's required right now. You're talking about pipelines, and the problem with so much of the stuff that's happening right now is it's taking too long, both on the adaptation side and the mitigation side. In this case, about climate, speed equals justice, speed equals equity. Speed is really, really important. We don't have time for 10-year studies on whether we can put a transmission grid up here or not. I mean, the kind of urgency in moving this whole conversation faster, I think, is a really important thing to underscore.
Well, and I think a key way to do that is to use some of the language of our friend Dan Carroll from Milken, is the bottom-up solutions. And how do we get that capital more directly to people who know what the solutions are, who have the solutions? How do we get more of that connective tissue there? I know that Milken's been working on a platform to do that connecting of the project developers to the capital. Also, there are players like Encourage Capital in developing world markets. Some of these players who are in these countries and who are capitalizing the local institutions with the money to finance, for instance, solar on commercial and industrial facilities to help small businesses to save money on their energy costs and be more resilient. So getting that institutional capital closer and doing a better job of connecting those. Do you guys have any other thoughts of how to do that better?
Yeah, I think, to the point that was made earlier in terms of speed, and a lot of the work that we're doing around, again, I keep emphasizing the risk analytics because it's so foundational in terms of, again, when you work with governments, and I think about the regional risk pools, when these were created, foundational to them was having that conversation of when you have a tropical cyclone passing through the Caribbean, what does it mean in terms of impact on your infrastructure, right? And that conversation led us to realize that for the governments, speed in terms of injection of liquidity to recover quickly was a priority for them. We did the same thing when we went to the African risk capacity looking at drought risk. The farmer can't wait, which is a traditional timeline, 9 months before financing comes to him, right, or her, right? They need that money as soon as the season fails, right? And so a lot of our thinking and some of the issues that we are also wrangling with within the industry is this question of linking the risk analytics to the finance, but the dimension of speed. If I think about, the experience in Morocco, it's not necessarily a climate-driven event, huge earthquake, right? They had a parametric insurance cover, quick trigger, 270 million, right? But then there's a challenge that is hit. How do you actually get that money from the central treasury to communities? And I think that this is where how can we work better with the public sector, the development actors, to really support governments, strengthening government capability, strengthening capability of civil society actors, etc. I think that there's so much more that we can do. And I heard you earlier talking about it's not only the speed and the financing, it's also the plumbing, the structures, right? And we have not invested in the capabilities of these countries to be able to support their communities in the way that they need to if we want to deliver results, right? And that's, I think, part of the challenge.
Absolutely. And here in the United States, the same thing with all the IRA money coming out. How do we quickly get that money deployed? Go ahead, Stacey.
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things that's been super exciting for me to watch lately has been among the IRA kind of among the things that are happening in the IRA, there's something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and Solar for All. And those two programs, which are administered by the EPA, have, for a whole bunch of other reasons, have created an ecosystem of community development finance institutions, green banks, quote-unquote microfinance actors that have filled a gap in the ecosystem of finance, right? So part of the plumbing. One of the issues that we have around finance is that we have a lot of big players and not a whole lot of little players and not a lot of connective tissue in many parts of the world. But here in the United States, this pot of money, $27 billion, is going to be flowing, and by September, hopefully past tense, flowed, to a network of essentially frontline investors. Now, many of them will be providing debt, not a lot of equity as far as what I'm hearing, but that is going to fund the bottom-up work that needs to be done for the energy transition. And it's a basket of incentives. It's concessional money in its flavor or color or however you want to call it. That's great in our current interest rate environment, which is not necessarily that high, but is a lot higher than it was a few years ago. When we had 2% interest rates, it was kind of hard to see how, a 25 basis point discount concessional loan was going to move the needle. But when you have 5 or 6% in the market, if you're able to kind of access capital to do, residential energy efficiency or multifamily housing, or electrification infrastructure in communities at a discount of from 5% to 3%, that could be material. That is going to be really interesting to watch. I'll also say two other things about it. Justice 40 is woven into it. So it's got a justice and equity component, which is absolutely amazing because the finance sector left to its own devices doesn't necessarily, you can't assume it's going to think about equity and justice on its own. So that's very important. And the second thing is it's $27 billion, hopefully past tense flowed by September, is, Gillian, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but potentially one of the largest amounts of climate finance flows out of the US government in a really long time. Now you can look at cumulative flows for the US government in the international space, and maybe we're not counting the domestic stuff as well as we should be, but it's a huge amount of money that's going to flow into the kind of economies in the front lines, in places where it's really needed. And that's really exciting to watch. Also, I will note by contrast that the carbon markets last year, I think, had $2 billion of transactions, so 27 billion to 2 billion. It's a lot, and it should be impactful.
Well, the IRA in its entirety is 368
100%.
billion.
And if we had something
Which
like
is the
that
biggest
for the
investment in
global
history anywhere.
south, in the developing world, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we do need a lot more of that investment in that connective tissue. I remember I've been talking to a number of institutions who work with small and micro enterprises, working with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and looking at how to ensure that they are receiving the support in mitigating the harm of climate change and also tapping into new business opportunities. And they learned a lot during the PPP and the COVID process of who can help to engage and support micro and small enterprises to get access to that. Those are the same players who can be engaged to help to ensure that they can be part of both accessing insurance and other resources that they need to mitigate the harm of climate change, but also build new opportunities to tap into the IRA. So it's exciting, I think, to see some learning on behalf of the public sector on how to connect to the actual folks on the ground through the organizations who already do that work, like CDFIs. I wanted to end with asking just a final wrap question around, we've talked a little bit about the most vulnerable communities and the importance there, but just any examples of projects and capital going to the most vulnerable communities, any structures or organizations you all have been working with as we continue to think about what are those models that we can help to scale up. That would be a great way to wrap up for our final kind of takeaway of an example and a call to action from each of you. Who wants to jump in?
I can use an example of a project which I think some of us are familiar with. I think there is an initiative with the SEWA, which is a trust for self-employed women in Asia, really trying to provide them with heat income insurance. When you have a heat wave, unfortunately, these women cannot go out and work. So part of what we've also, through this initiative, is to actually provide them with compensation as a result of lost income because they cannot work, right? And getting those resources to them so that they can still live and have continue their livelihood. So I think we are seeing a lot more of these innovative solutions emerging that I hope that we can scale because they connect, again, people to finance and livelihoods.
One example I could offer with our Save Our Seas initiative, which is focused on tackling the scourge of plastic pollution, which of course is very relevant to the climate crisis, because if the plastic life cycle were a country, it would be the world's 4th largest emitter of carbon emissions. So we've been working with municipalities globally targeting 40% of globally mismanaged plastic waste. And the ways in which this benefits local communities is that we're focused on building circular economies and specifically working with a very informal and typically very impoverished group of waste pickers in these communities, many of whom are women who don't have the kinds of rights or protections or access to capital. So trying to figure out how to formalize their engagement in the process of identifying plastic and building the infrastructure to recycle that. More importantly, looking at things like extended producer responsibility to reduce the production of plastic in the first place, because so little plastic is recycled. But with many of these economies and interventions, thinking about who can be getting the jobs and are they going to be, good paying jobs is so important.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'll just be very quick and do a quick shout out. I was going to mention the project you beat me to it because that's a really interesting project. But I think in a sort of bigger, I want to do just a big shout out to a bigger thing, which is what Paris has done in reimagining the city of Paris, which is a really complicated project that is tied up with the Olympics and everything. But it's really inspiring when you think about how much can be done with the right political will and the right shifting of the flows of money. So we're seeing things like this creation of public spaces for cooling off, which are really important, like making the Seine swimmable on many days, much more nature in the urban areas, reimagining the Champs-Élysées to put up a lot more trees and turn the Place de la Concorde, which is now like a frying pan, into something that is habitable. And this sort of reimagining of even an ancient iconic city like Paris, which includes rebuilding a lot of the sort of low-income architecture and things like that, is really important, and to me one of the sort of most inspiring sort of big picture projects of how we can use this moment to reimagine our world.
Thank you.
Well, I mentioned the project from the Green Bank, but maybe another one. We worked with a bank in Tanzania to put together an agriculture investment platform, specifically focused on regenerative ag practices and things that were addressing the kind of climate-related risk, physical risk needs of the ag sector in the country. And the work we did with the bank was really to help them set up a facility where they could lend in local currency, where they could help with the capacity building. They had a technical assistance sidecar. That project was funded through the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the international climate funds, and then in addition to the kind of project that they put together, they were also becoming accredited, which of course is country ownership for managing some of those flows, which is a great kind of story from the country's perspective.
I'm glad we ended on agriculture because it is such a big source of the problem and so critical to shift for food security and for climate resilience and mitigation. So thank you all for joining us today and sharing your insights and for what you do every day. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please make your way to your next session.